Welcome back to chapter 13, where we are discussing the endocrine system. This is video number 3. So last video, we ended speaking about negative and positive feedback, what the difference is, and how that helps to regulate homeostasis within the body. Now let's start getting into individual glands of the endocrine system. The first gland that we're going to talk about is the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland, just as an FYI, is called the master gland. The pituitary gland is called the master gland. The reason it's called the master gland is because it secretes hormones that control and regulate most of the other glands in the body. So it is the primary reason why most of the other glands will either secrete or stop secreting their hormone products. So the pituitary lies at the base of the brain in the sella turcica. So if you remember from last semester, when you were going over the bones of the face and skull, one of the bones was called the sphenoid bone. That sphenoid bone sat behind the forehead, behind the nose, and you had the greater and lesser wings, etc., etc. One of the structures that's a part of the sphenoid bone is the sella turcica. It looks like a little U-shaped space. That is where the pituitary gland sits. It is being protected by the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. The pituitary gland is controlled by the brain. Of course, again, it is connected to the brain. It's considered part of the nervous system, right? So we have a gland that is considered part of the nervous system. It is attached to the hypothalamus of the brain, and the part of the structure that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus is called the pituitary stalk. You may also see it referred to as the infundibulum. You need to know both terms because you may see either one in textbooks, medical literature, etc. So, pituitary gland is connected to the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, by the pituitary stalk. There are two distinct parts of the pituitary. You have the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Remember that anterior means in the front, posterior means toward the back. So these are basically two halves of the same structure, the same organ, but they have very specific differences. So the anterior lobe is called adenohypophysis. The posterior lobe is called neurohypophysis. Please make sure you look up the prefixes adeno and neuro. Know what those two mean so that you can know part of the specific differences between the anterior and the posterior lobes of the pituitary gland. So, like I said, we have two different portions to the pituitary gland, the anterior and the posterior lobes. Both of these lobes are controlled in different ways because they're made up of slightly different materials. They have slightly different ways that they function to basically have the same outcome. The outcome being that it produces certain hormones that will then travel through the bloodstream and control other organs and how they function. So, controlled by two different methods of the hypothalamus. You have a small intermediate lobe, so anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and then an intermediate lobe called the pars intermedia. The pars intermedia develops in the fetus and it produces melanocyte stimulating hormone. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, which, as you should be able to deduce from the name, it is a hormone that stimulates the melanocytes or cells, cyte means cell, that produce melanin. Okay, so the third part of the pituitary is the pars intermedia, and it produces MSH that starts producing melanin. So in your brain, you have the pituitary gland here. I know it looks like testicles, looks like little testicles. Please don't get it mixed up when you see the pituitary outside of like the skull and the brain, and think that it's the testicles. Make sure that you look at it enough that you can tell the difference. But anyway, so this would be the anterior lobe, this would be the posterior lobe, this would be the infundibulum that is connecting it to the hypothalamus in the brain. This bone would be the sphenoid bone. This um, this portion of that bone is the sella turcica. All right. So let's talk about how the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. The anterior lobe. So hypothalamic releasing hormones or hypothalamic release inhibiting hormones are transported to the anterior lobe through the hypophyseal portal veins. All right, so let's start with the first couple terms. Hypothalamic releasing hormone. These are hormones that are released from the hypothalamus that encourage the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, to actually release its hormones. All right. So the hypothalamus, the pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus then controls the pituitary. That's why the title of this slide is hypothalamic control of the pituitary gland. So you have hypothalamic releasing hormones, which are hormone secretions from the hypothalamus that encourage the anterior pituitary to release its structures. Then you have your hypothalamic release inhibiting hormones are hormones that inhibit the release of hormones from the pituitary. So, by looking at the releasing hormones and the release inhibiting hormones, you can see how the hypothalamus then controls what the pituitary does, and that will control how the pituitary controls the other organs. And the way that these hormones from the hypothalamus get to that anterior lobe of the pituitary is through this vein. It is the hypophyseal portal vein. So go ahead and make sure that you look up what a portal system is so that you can understand that concept. There are several different portal systems in the body. This happens to be one of the hypophyseal portal system. Portal vein that will bring these hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So, I already mentioned that each releasing hormone acts on a specific group of cells in the anterior pituitary and can stimulate or inhibit pituitary secretion. So we already know that it can stimulate or inhibit because you either have hormones that are going to tell it to release or tell it to stop releasing. Now, it says that each releasing hormone acts on a specific group of cells. Each cell is going to produce a very particular hormone. It's very uncommon to find a particular cell that will produce more than one product. Okay, so if this hormone or the particular hormone acts on a particular cell, then that particular cell is going to control the release or the inhibition of release of a particular hormone. I do hope that made sense. All right. So that is how the anterior lobe of the pituitary is regulated. Now, the posterior lobe, slightly different. The posterior lobe is regulated more by nerve impulses. So remember, you had adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. Adeno refers to hormone or gland. And so the anterior aspect of the lobe is this glandular release is controlling the pituitary glandular release. whereas the posterior lobe is more nervous control, which is why it's a neuro hypothesis. All right. Yes, okay. So posterior lobe regulation, the nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. So again, we're still being controlled by the hypothalamus, but this time instead of hormones controlling the function of the pituitary, it is nerve impulses. So nerve impulses from the hypothalamus travel to the posterior lobe through the infundibulum. So in the anterior lobe, we have uh, the hypophyseal portal vein. So basically, it is like a blood vessel that is, well, it is a blood vessel that is transporting a hormone from one place to another. Because remember, that is how we define a hormone. Hormones travel in the blood from one place to another. So this is the vein that is accepting this hormone from the hypothalamus and taking it to the pituitary. When you look at the posterior lobe, it is not a vein because these are nerve impulses. So this nerve or these nerves in the hypothalamus will travel through the infundibulum to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and it will then stimulate the nerves that are in the posterior lobe to then release hormones. So anterior lobe is more hormonal controlled. Posterior lobe is nervous control, which is why, going back, which is why the anterior lobe is called adeno hypophysis, and the posterior lobe is called neuro hypophysis. And these are just examples. So remember, this is the anterior aspect. This is the posterior aspect of the pituitary. This is the sella turcica, the bone that is a part of the sphenoid bone that holds and protects the pituitary. The anterior portion is going to have these portal veins from the hypothalamus that lead to the pituitary. And since hormones travel in the bloodstream, it's going to release its hormones into the bloodstream of this vein. It will travel here to the pituitary, the anterior pituitary. You'll notice that these are neurons that are in the hypothalamus. Those neurons are then, let me go to the other picture. The neurons are then going to travel through the infundibulum and go to the posterior lobe to stimulate or inhibit the posterior lobe and control its function. All right, hypothalamic control of peripheral endocrine glands. Let's start with reading it. So the hypothalamus, which is an endocrine gland, controls hormone secretion from peripheral endocrine glands via three stepways. So remember that the periphery is like everything that's not in the middle. It's the stuff on the outskirts. So there are three ways there's a three-step pathway that the hypothalamus is going to control secretions from these other glands. You have releasing hormones or release inhibiting hormones. You have the anterior pituitary hormone, and you have the peripheral endocrine gland. All right, so release or release inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus act on specific hormone secreting cells in the anterior pituitary. So again, the hypothalamus will release these hormones that tell it to either produce more or stop producing or produce less of a hormone, telling the anterior pituitary to produce more or less of a particular hormone. Anterior pituitary hormones will then act on the cells in a peripheral endocrine gland to stimulate secretion. So remember I said that the pituitary is a master gland. So the pituitary will then secrete hormones to tell the other endocrine glands to either produce or stop producing. So the anterior pituitary might tell the ovaries or the testes or the adrenal glands to produce their secretions. And then you have the peripheral endocrine gland that secretes its hormones, which exerts effects on the target organs. So once these glands secrete their product, they're going to also go into the bloodstream, and the target organ, target cells, whichever cells have the receptors for that particular hormone will then step up and start to do what it needs to do. All right, so that is the three-step process on how we end up getting those target cells, all of these peripheral endocrine glands to secrete their product. Usually, there are multiple negative feedback controls involved in these pathways. So you will have negative feedback at many different steps. So that's how the body attempts to regulate the production of the hormones. There's like a checks and balance system where you have many different checkpoints. So the final hormone in the pathway inhibits secretion of both the releasing hormone and the anterior pituitary hormone. Anterior pituitary hormone then inhibits the secretion of the releasing hormone. So when this hormone is being produced, it will then go back and it will stop the producing of that so that it can continue to produce what it needs to produce. All right, so this ends up controlling that while this is controlling that. It becomes a cycle. This is a visual explanation of what we just talked about. So make sure you look at this, especially if you are a visual learner, to help you see what it is that, how everything controls everything. So remember, the red is inhibition. When you see the negative, that means inhibition. The plus and green is stimulation. So this is how everything's going to move forward. And these are the ways that we can inhibit or have that negative feedback or that control of these organs. Also, please note that these figures should also be in your textbook. So if you need this explained as well, use your textbook as a reference. So now let's talk about the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary. The anterior lobe of the pituitary consists of glandular epithelial tissues. I bet you didn't think that we would go back to A&P1, the beginning of A&P1. This is glandular epithelial tissues. Anterior pituitary hormones are produced in the anterior lobe by one of 5 types of secretory cells. So you have 5 different types of cells that will secrete the different hormones being produced by the anterior pituitary. Each anterior lobe hormone is released in response to a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Some are inhibited by release inhibiting hormones by the hypothalamus. So again, releasing hormones, release inhibiting hormones will control whether or not the anterior pituitary is actually releasing a hormone or not. Some of the major hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, you have your growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. This is pronounced luteinizing. You should start to recognize some word parts like tropic. We talked about that earlier in the chapter. So if you don't remember, please scroll back toward the beginning of the PowerPoint to look at what the PowerPoint says about tropic. You can also check your textbook and look at the definition so that anytime you see this ending tropic, you'll know what it means. Thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is a hormone that will stimulate the thyroid to produce its product. So this is not produced by the thyroid. It is produced by the anterior pituitary, but it controls the thyroid. Prolactin, lactate. So this hormone Pro means for or to produce or something, to make it move forward. So prolactin is a hormone that will stimulate the glands of the breast to produce milk, right? So lactate, lact, lact means milk. So this is a hormone again that will stimulate milk production. Sidebar, anytime you have a person who is not pregnant and has not just produced a baby or is male and they start lactating out of that breast tissue, more than likely that person has a prolactinoma. They have a tumor of the pituitary, specifically of the cells that produce prolactin. Releasing hormones of the hypothalamus. All right. Secretion of each anterior pituitary hormone is regulated by a releasing hormone, a release inhibiting hormone, or both from the hypothalamus. All right. So again, we have the hormones that tell the pituitary to release some stuff. We have hormones that tell the pituitary to stop releasing stuff. Growth hormone. So remember that these are hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. You have the growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. Before I continue, I want to give you a sidebar. So, adrenocorticotropic. Words like this in science and in medicine are not uncommon. Those big, big, long words that seem ridiculously long, they are, but this is part of the reason why I stress learning terminology, learning word parts, because once you do, they get much easier to read and to say. Adreno. So we're talking, well, actually, we can even break it down. Add, in addition, renal, kidney, all right? Adrenal is an organ that sits on top of the kidneys. So adrenal, cortical, that refers to the cortex, and tropic, that refers to how something is released, all right? So this becomes a much simpler term when you're able to break it down. It's simpler to understand and it's simpler to say. All right, so let's go back. So growth hormone is released from the anterior pituitary by growth hormone releasing hormone, and it's inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone. All right, so very straightforward. Remember, we said we have releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones, release inhibiting hormones, and each of them will be specific for a particular hormone. So this one is a growth hormone releasing hormone. All right, so this is produced by the hypothalamus. This is a releasing hormone produced by the hypothalamus that will go to the anterior pituitary to tell the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Or you have the growth hormone inhibiting hormone produced by the hypothalamus to tell the anterior pituitary to stop producing growth hormone. All right, so that is how they work. Now, some of them have more than one name. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone is also called somatostatin. Somatostatin. All right, so there's that. Prolactin is inhibited by prolactin inhibiting hormone and is released by prolactin releasing factor. So even though this is not called releasing hormone, it's called a releasing factor, it is still promoting the release, the production and release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary. All right, and you see it on each one. So thyrotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which then in turn stimulates the thyroid to release its product. I know it's a lot of steps, but once you get it, it becomes easier. But yeah, I know that it's a little bit it can be a little bit confusing. So adrenocorticotropic hormone is released by corticotropin releasing hormone, and then follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both released by gonadotropin releasing hormone. So remember, a gonad is the overall name for the organ, the sex organs, so male and female sex organs. So these two hormones act on the hormones that release sex hormones. So one is going to stimulate follicles and one is going to mature the follicles. All right. So they're both released by gonadotropin releasing hormones. The functions of the anterior pituitary hormones. All right. So let's go back. Well, no, a growth hormone is also called somatotropin. Growth hormone is called somatotropin. Let's go back. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone is called somatostatin. So statin, something that's static is still, it's not moving. All right. So somatostatin is inhibiting growth hormone, and growth hormone is called somatotropin. So understanding the difference between statin and tropin will be helpful. All right. So growth hormone will stimulate cells to get larger and to divide rapidly. When this happens, this increases the uptake of amino acids and increases protein synthesis by the cells. So your cells will take in all the amino acids and start using those amino acids to build proteins. Remember that proteins are made from amino acid building blocks. Your growth hormone will decrease the rate of the use of carbohydrates and increase the rate of fat usage. So then, when you have more growth hormone being produced by the body, it is going to tell the rest of the cells of your body to switch from using carbohydrates as an energy source, switch to using fat as an energy source. Prolactin, I already mentioned that earlier. When you hear lact or lacto, think lactation, think milk. Pro means I'm going for it, for it. It is providing like a push to get it done. So prolactin is a hormone that promotes milk production. Um, it promotes milk production in those that bear children, right? And so when someone born female is pregnant, toward their as they get toward the end of their pregnancy, the breasts start to develop more and more. And then when you get closer to the delivery date, then she will likely start actually producing milk, or the ability to produce milk from her breasts. We know that males also produce prolactin, but we don't know what the function is in males. But I will say again, um, I mentioned this earlier in this video, if you have someone that is born male that starts to lactate, that starts to produce milk from their breast tissue, and it absolutely does happen, then you want to consider that they might have a tumor, a cancerous tumor in the anterior pituitary, specifically for the cells that produce prolactin. Increased prolactin production will promote milk production. So that is one way that we know if a male has breast cancer. And again, males can get breast cancer. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. TSH is produced by the anterior pituitary to stimulate the thyroid to secrete two of its hormones, T3 and T4. T3 is triiodo, why am I blanking on it right now? Triiodothyronine. And T4 is thyroxine. So those are two of the three main hormones produced by the thyroid, and they are released from the thyroid when they are stimulated by TSH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the secretion of cortisol and other glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. So cortex, cortisol, right? Adrenal from the adrenals. So adrenocorticotropic stimulates the adrenal glands, the cortex of the adrenal glands, to produce cortisol and other glucocorticoids. Follicle stimulating hormone causes the growth and development of ovarian follicles and sperm production. So the follicles that are being stimulated are the follicles that are producing, housing, and developing eggs in people born female and sperm in people born male. Luteinizing hormone will then cause ovulation in females, and in males and females, uh, production of sex hormones. So let's actually stop the video here and we will continue with the rest of the PowerPoint in the next video.